I'm Georges Simenon. Welcome to my new case.
The rain had been falling since late afternoon, barely more than a mist that settled on the window panes and made the street beyond look like a watercolor someone kept dabbing with a wet brush. Maigret sat at the small kitchen table with his coat thrown over the chair beside him, a pipe cooling between his fingers, and watched his wife rinse chicory from a filter. There was stew still warm on the stove, and the apartment smelled faintly of onions and damp wool. They had spoken very little since dinner. He was content to listen to the small domestic sounds, spoon against enamel, a cupboard closing softly, someone upstairs crossing a room with a dragging step as if reluctant to arrive anywhere. "Is it still coming down?" Madame Maigret asked without turning. "Not enough to wash anything away," he said. "Just enough to make it all stick." He meant the weather, of course, but also the day. One of those days when trivialities accumulate. A routine file shoved across his desk with a note from the deputy prosecutor, 2 telephone calls from embittered shopkeepers about boys who had stolen bottles, an old drunkard who insisted he had found the key to a bank vault in the gutter and would only hand it over if he could speak to the minister. The kind of day that left you more tired than if you'd chased a murderer down the Rue de Rivoli. And an ache behind the left eye, the one that felt the damp first. Madame Maigret set down a cup in front of him. She wore a navy cardigan and had pinned her hair up for the night, not tightly, so that wisps escaped near her ears. He watched the steam rise, fog the glass of his spectacles, then clear. The cup warmed his hands. The radio in the corner was turned low. A woman sang a song about a station platform, her voice small and stubborn as a bird's. "You look as if you're waiting," she said. "I'm not waiting for anything." He forced a smile, but he knew the way his face sagged when he was irritable and tired. "I'm only thinking how a man can go through a whole day of police work and end with nothing to show for it but wet shoes." "You could dry them," she said practically. "By the stove is best." He nodded but did not move. He had come home earlier than usual and eaten without appetite, taking pleasure only in the bread, crusty and still warm. Afterwards he had sat as he was now, feeling the weight of the rain as if it lay on his shoulders. There had been the trivialities, yes, but there had also been the telephone calls that didn't come. He had sent Janvier to a tenement near the Mouffetard, where a woman had complained of noises in the staircase at odd hours, not quarrels, not music, only a sound like a broom handle tapping, once, twice, then silence. He had sent Lapointe to question a baker who admitted to putting sawdust in the flour, but swore no one had fallen ill. Files and errands, the kind of police that never makes headlines. He had told himself he was glad of it. At Arp, his age a quiet week was a blessing, but the city was like an old horse that you knew too well. When it walked steadily, head down, it was because it had decided to be cunning. He drank his coffee, set the cup down, and then, because old habits are stronger than comfort, he rose and slipped on his shoes again. The leather had cooled and took a moment to accept his feet. He reached for his coat, and Madame Maigret looked up without surprise. "You'll take a scarf," she said. "It's a wet cold." He obeyed, and her hands, brisk and sure, straightened the knot under his chin. He kissed her with the quick tenderness that belonged to them alone and went out. In the stairwell, the light was failing. The bulb had been replaced by a cheaper kind that made everything look the color of old paper. He descended slowly, one hand on the polished rail, listening to the hum of the building, a faucet somewhere, the muffled cough of a child, the smell of cabbage that seeped from the concierge's lodge even when no cabbage was cooking. He could have taken a taxi, but he preferred to walk. He told himself it was to keep the stiffness from his knees, but he knew that walking was another way of listening. The boulevard was busy enough, though the umbrellas kept people close to themselves and blurred their outlines. Headlights smeared in the wet. He turned down a narrower street that ran crookedly like a line drawn without a ruler, crossed a square with a linden that had started to shed its leaves prematurely, and came to a quartier he knew as one knows an old coat, by the feel of the pockets. There were 2 cafes opposite one another, one loud with laughter and cheap wine, the other timid, with a few solitary drinkers who turned their heads when the door opened. A cobbler's shop, shuttered now, had a sign that announced souls repaired while you wait. A florist's window showed flowers that looked like survivors. Not pretty exactly, but stubborn. He paused and watched a tram pass with the weary determination of a civil servant. He had no case to draw him there. He had no reason at all. Yet his boots found their way, as boots will when the man has made up his mind before the thought has formed. He crossed another street where the puddles were deeper and the reflections of the lamps trembled when the wind nudged them. Beyond a stand of plane trees, the neighborhood shifted. It was not poorer, merely more neglected. Paint peeled, plaster flaked, shutters whose hinges had learned to complain. The rain sounded different there, sharper, as if the roofs were thinner. That was when he remembered the phrase Lognan had used that morning, tossed off like a grumble about his rheumatism. Lognan was one of those men who collected misfortunes the way others collect stamps. He wore them with the same pride and the same gloom. "There's a street," he'd said, "down by the disused tram depot that has one lamp working. The rest have gone for months. They complain, the residents. Nothing happens. It's not my precinct." He had offered the phrase to the room as proof that Paris was getting worse in small ways that nobody noticed until they tripped on them. Maigret had not replied. He had been smoothing the paper on his desk and thinking of nothing at all, but the phrase had stuck to him like the rain to his coat. He found the depot easily, because neglect is a kind of signpost. The metal gates were chained, but not locked. The chain itself had been looped so carelessly that a child could have undone it. Inside, the shelters sagged. A cat slipped from a pile of crates and paused to look at him with insolent eyes. He went on. The street beyond the depot was little more than an alley that refused to call itself one. It had a name. He read it by touch rather than sight, the letters corroded. And it had, indeed, one lamp. The others were dark, their glass bowls streaked with grime as blind as cataracts. The one that still worked threw a circle of sickly light onto the wet stones, and beyond the circle, the darkness thickened. Not menacing, simply stubborn. There were houses on one side, 4-story, their windows narrow and uncurtained. The other side offered the blank backs of warehouses and a small courtyard with a gate that someone had painted blue a long time ago and then given up on. He stood under the lamp and filled his pipe without lighting it, letting the rain settle on the brim of his hat, listening. Far away, a bus sighed. Nearer, he heard water ticking from a gutter and the faint rub of cloth when someone adjusted a sleeve or a scarf. He waited. He had learned a long time ago that waiting could be a kind of question. In the nearest doorway, an old woman stood with a basket on her arm. She had the face of someone who had spent more time thinking than speaking, and she watched him with the curiosity that Parisians grant to uniformed men even when the uniform is hidden by a civilian coat. Maigret tipped his hat. She nodded, but did not smile. "Your lamp is faithful," he said. She looked up as if surprised to find it there. "It was repaired in August," she said. "The others are all under promise." "Promises are good for keeping warm," he said. The old woman snorted softly, pleased. "They tell us there is a shortage," she said. "Perhaps they are right. There is always a shortage of something. Last year it was coal. Before that, patience." He gestured with his head toward the darkness beyond. "Do people pass through?" "Only the ones who know where they're going," she said. "It's not a place for strolling." He thanked her and moved on. The circle of light didn't follow him. It let him go and resumed shining on what it always shone on. A broken flagstone, a manhole cover with a missing bolt, a cigarette butt that had swelled with water until it could swell no more. In the dark, the sound changed again. His boots softened. He tried the blue gate. It held, but with a give that suggested it would not hold against insistence. He did not insist. He ran his fingertips over the paint and came away with flaking blue on his skin. There was a figure halfway down the street, or perhaps there was none. It was the sort of shadow that could have been a man's shoulder or only two shadows leaning together. He did not call out. He stood and listened and heard, distinctly, the tap-tap Lognon's woman had described, as if a broom handle had met wood twice and then reconsidered its purpose. After that, nothing. The rain gathered itself, retreated, and came back, undecided. He lit his pipe then, not because he needed smoke, but because the small ceremony warmed his hands. The flame showed him the wetness on the stones and the extremely clean doorstep of the third house along, where someone had washed away the city from their threshold with such energy that the water still ran in a thin, determined rivulet to the gutter. He looked up. In the second-floor window of that house, a curtain moved and paused. There was time in the pause for someone to measure him and decide he was uninteresting. He would have said he had come only to shake off the day. But standing there, pipe in mouth, he felt the city settle into an attitude he recognized. That watchfulness that is not hostility, the way a room grows quiet when a child has done something it cannot undo and waits to be found out. He did not feel alarm. He felt, faintly, the interest that makes a man linger under a single lamp when home is warm and the stew will be better tomorrow after standing. On his way back, he nodded again to the old woman who had not moved. "Good evening," he said. "It will be if the rain decides what it wants," she replied. At the corner, he glanced back. The lamp made its small, unwavering circle, and beyond it the darkness kept its counsel. He thought of his wife arranging his scarf, of the cup on the table with its brown ring, and of Lognon, who would blame the weather for whatever went wrong. The day had offered nothing, but now it offered a street that pretended to be asleep and was only listening, and a sound that had been made twice because once was not enough. He walked on, not quickly, and told himself he would sleep well. He knew he would not. He reached the apartment a little before 10, shook his hat by the stove as his wife had advised, and let the coat steam on its hook. The kitchen held its gentle heat. The stew had settled. He said nothing about the lamp or the taps. "It will rain till morning," he said, and she nodded. In bed, he listened to the gutters composing themselves, then slept the kind of sleep that keeps an ear open. He woke before the alarm. Paris looked pewter through the window, rinsed but not clean. He dressed with the patience he used for witnesses, drank coffee, ate bread and cheese, and left earlier than habit. Madame Maigret watched him knot his scarf and did not ask where he was going. That had been settled years ago. He went where his face had turned. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were damp with people's coats. Janvier had left a note about Mouffetard. Pipes, nothing. Maigret signed 2 papers for the prosecutor, dictated a line to Poitiers about a brother bureaucracy had learned by heart, then told Lapointe, too cheerful for the hour, to bring him the second-floor tenants of the street by the tram depot. "Second floors?" Lapointe said. "They see more," Maigret answered, and went out. The bakery near the depot breathed warmth. He bought a small loaf as if one could pocket-proof and walked on. Daylight had squared the little street. The dead lamps looked honestly blind. The one that had burned now seemed an obedient employee. The old woman with the basket was gone. The clean doorstep at the third house had dried to a faint tide mark. He rang. The bell made a thin, frugal sound. A bolt slid. A woman with a red scarf and a sweater buttoned wrong appeared, the sort of concierge who was also everything else. She looked at his face, then at his shoes. "If it's the lamp, that's the city," she said. "It's about your second floor," he said. "Third window from the left." She considered him. "Mademoiselle Berthe," she said. "Laundry at the hotel on the boulevard. She scrubs until a thing gives up." "May I go up?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. The stairs were narrow, the banister polished by cautious hands. The second-floor corridor held 3 doors with numbers that tried to look official. Number 3 had the clean threshold, the wood around the keyhole unscarred. He knocked without hurry. "Police," he said through the wood. "Not urgent." A bolt moved the width of a coin. An eye studied him, steady but rimmed with fatigue. When the door opened, the hallway stepped back from the smell of soap. Mademoiselle Berthe stood with damp hair combed flat and hands red from work. "I have nothing," she began. "If it is the hotel, they say I lose buttons. I keep them in a jar." "It isn't buttons," he said. "Last night there were 2 taps, then a curtain moved." She exhaled. "That is the neighbor," she said, nodding to the door opposite. "He taps twice when he's late. She answers once, so he knows to lift the latch. Their little code." "And last night?" She did not answer. "Work?" "He's sometimes at the depot. She keeps books for a barrow. Quiet people. On Sundays he drinks and apologizes." He thanked her and crossed to the Lachaume's door. The paint had learned to chip like the blue gate outside. He listened before he knocked. There is a smell that does not belong to morning. Metallic, like coins counted with wet fingers, and he thought he felt it crowding at the edges of the wood. He knocked. Nothing. He tried the handle. It held with the indifference of a door that expects a key. He waited. Waiting is a key that does not scrape. The hall smelled of wet, rope and cheap polish today. The concierge had climbed after him to claim her staircase. "They have not gone out," she whispered. "When do they rise?" "She's up early for the books," the woman said. "He waits for work to begin." Monday sounded like an alibi that didn't quite reach. "Do you keep a spare?" "No," she said too fast. Then, "For the laundry girl only. She loses hers in pockets. For these, no, they are proud of being poor properly." He looked at the jam. Someone had wiped it recently, but not thoroughly. The smear showed clean wood beneath the gray. He tapped the door twice as the husband would have. The corridor held its breath. From inside came a sound like a glass, agreeing to move and changing its mind. He nodded, as if a small working doubt had just adopted a name. "I will send for Lapointe," he said mildly. "And a locksmith who does not ask questions." The concierge looked offended. "Our locksmith minds his business," she said. "Good," Maigret replied. "Today his business is this door." They waited at the bottom of the stairs like accomplices undecided about repentance. The courtyard smelled of cabbage that did not exist. Lapointe arrived, hat damp, smile intact. "No noise," Maigret said. "Only a key that belongs to us for 3 minutes." The locksmith, when he came, was a man born to keep lids on things. He examined the lock as if greeting an aunt, worked gently, and the bolt surrendered with a sigh that was not relief. The door moved. The smell that does not belong to morning stepped into the corridor and became a fact. Lapointe looked at the floor. Maigret touched his arm. "After me," he said without drama, and stood in the threshold to let the room speak before it had to answer. The flat was modest, the kind of place where rooms had been divided by need rather than design, and every corner carried a layer of human compromise. The air held the stale perfume of poverty mixed with something sharper, unmistakable, the iron note of blood that had lost its first heat. The curtains were half drawn, but enough light slipped through to make the interior seem indifferent to discovery. A table had been set for 2, though only one plate bore the trace of food, a crust left beside a knife. On the floor, against the chair that had been pushed back in haste, lay a man. His shirt was darkened at the chest, and his eyes stared at the ceiling beams as if expecting them to offer explanation. Lapointe drew in a breath as if to speak, but Maigret lifted a hand, quieting him. He stepped inside, slow, the pipe stem still between his fingers though it was unlit. He studied the body without bending too close, his gaze moving from the loosened belt at the man's waist to the worn soles of his shoes. A laborer, surely. His hands bore the grime that never washes out fully, the ingrained black at the nails. The face, however, told of a gentler man, or at least one not hardened by drink or blows. His expression had been erased, not twisted, which spoke of surprise rather than struggle. La Chaume? The concierge whispered behind them, as if naming the corpse gave her a kind of authority over it. She stood in the doorway, her fingers worrying at the edge of her apron. He went sometimes to the depot, I told you. Her voice trembled, not from grief, but from the fact of police work brushing against her staircase. Where is his wife? Maigret asked softly. The concierge swallowed. She should be here. The flat answered in silence. The bed, through a half-open door, was made too neatly for the morning. On the dresser, a comb lay beside a mirror with a crack through its corner, and beside that, a purse stood open with coins still inside, as if interrupted in use. Maigret touched nothing. He walked the perimeter of the room, listening for what the silence might give. In the kitchen alcove, a pan with 2 eggs unbroken sat on the stove. Someone had begun breakfast and abandoned it. Lapointe crouched, examining the body more closely. No sign of a struggle, he murmured. The knife. Where is it? Gone, Maigret said simply. He straightened, looking again at the table. 2 glasses, one with water cloudy from the bread dipped in it, the other empty, but for a ring. He bent to sniff. Cheap red wine, not fresh enough to carry warmth, only the sour echo. He looked at the chair across from the dead man. It was drawn back, but neatly, as if the occupant had not risen in panic. Whoever had sat there had left with deliberation, not flight. He moved to the window. The curtain still bore the crease of a hand where it had been drawn aside the night before. From that vantage, one could see the lamp below, the pool of light, the clean doorstep. It was the same view that had watched him when he stood smoking in the rain. A curtain moved and paused. He remembered the gesture. It had been here. He allowed the memory to settle into fact. Locksmith, he said over his shoulder, you'll give your name to Lapointe before you leave. The man nodded quickly, unused to seeing death except in rumors. The concierge wrung her apron tighter. Maigret looked again at the corpse. He ate, he said, half to himself. He tapped twice on the door, as he always did, and he ate. But his wife did not answer. Where did she sit? Lapointe gestured to the other chair. Then where is she? The question was simple, too simple, but it filled the room with weight. The absence of the woman spoke louder than the body. Maigret felt it the way one feels a draft from a door left ajar, slight but undeniable. He turned to the concierge. Tell me about her. The woman shifted uneasily. Louise? Quiet, as I said. She kept books for a barrow on the market. A tidy woman. She did not make debts. They were a respectable pair. He drank, but only on Sundays. She bore it. She hesitated. Once she went to her sister's in Ivry for a week. That was last spring. She said she was helping with a child, otherwise she was always here. Friends, Maigret pressed. None that came through this door. They were for themselves. He nodded. The simplicity of such couples often concealed the tight knots of resentment or desire. He moved toward the bedroom. The wardrobe stood open slightly, enough to suggest haste. Dresses hung within, plain, serviceable. A pair of shoes was missing. On the bed lay a folded cardigan, but the drawer beside it gaped, stockings half pulled from their place. He touched the fabric, still warm with the body that had worn it in the night. She had left with little more than what she could carry quickly. Back in the main room, he crouched at last by the dead man. The wound was clean, a single thrust, placed without clumsiness. It had been aimed, not accidental. He studied the hands again. They bore no defensive marks. He had not raised them. He had been taken unawares, perhaps even while speaking. Neighbors? Maigret asked, rising. The concierge nodded toward the opposite door. They heard nothing. Then they will tell me so. He tapped his pipe against his palm, considering. The absence of the knife, the absence of the wife, the careful breakfast half completed. These were not random absences. They spoke in chorus, though the words were still hidden. "La Pointe," he said. "Keep the locksmith and the concierge here. No one leaves. I'll speak to Berthe again. She watches more than she admits." He descended the stairs slowly, letting each step register its protest under his weight. The laundry girl's door opened before he knocked. She stood with damp hands, wringing a cloth. Her eyes searched his face, found the truth before he spoke, and turned away. "You saw her leave," Maigret said. Berthe's lips trembled. "I heard the door. I thought it was early for the market. She had her shawl. She walked fast." She looked at him, frightened. "Is he—" Maigret's silence gave her the answer. She covered her mouth with the cloth as if to catch the words she dared not say. "I thought they were happy," she whispered, but the words sounded like an excuse she had rehearsed for herself. He left her with her cloth and her silence, stepped into the street. The lamp was still dead, its glass clouded. The one light that had burned faithfully last night now flickered, struggling in the daylight as if reluctant to give up its task. The stones still bore the faint trail of water from the clean doorstep, now dried to a dull line. He stood, pipe unlit, and felt again the city waiting. Somewhere Louise Lachaume walked with her shoes still damp from yesterday's rain, and the absence of her knife weighed more than the body upstairs. He drew in a long breath, not of satisfaction, but of inevitability. This was no longer a street with one lamp. It was a street with a silence that had chosen its secret. He would have to listen until it spoke. Maigret lingered in the street, the loaf from the bakery still under his arm, though now it felt out of place, a domestic object in a setting that had lost its innocence. The cobbles were drying under a wind that had turned sharp, lifting the edges of paper caught against the gutters. He drew on his unlit pipe, a habit more than a gesture, and studied the row of windows above. Behind those panes, people were waiting, ears pressed to silence, their day suspended by the presence of police. It was a silence that thickened the air, making even the drip from a gutter sound intrusive. He turned, stepped back into the building, and climbed once more to the second floor. La Pointe was standing just inside the Lachaume's flat, arms folded, his usual lightness dimmed. The locksmith had gone, his business concluded, and the concierge hovered in the hall, restless, her apron already twisted beyond recognition. "Nothing moved since you left," La Pointe reported. Maigret nodded, letting his gaze pass again over the room, the table, the solitary plate with its bread crust. He bent and sniffed the wine glass once more, then set it down without comment. The silence in the room was not emptiness. It was the residue of interruption. "Send for the doctor," he said, "and tell Janvier to come. He'll see to the papers." La Pointe moved quickly, relieved at being given something to do. Alone with the concierge, Maigret asked, "You said they kept to themselves. Did anyone come visiting, anyone in particular?" She shook her head. "Not often. Once or twice a man came, short, heavy, with a cap, but always in the afternoon, never late. I thought it was for work. He and Lachaume spoke downstairs, not here. She never offered coffee." She pursed her lips as if the omission were itself suspicious. "What did the wife do when he came?" Maigret asked. "She stayed up here. Once I saw her at the window, but she pulled back quick." The concierge lowered her voice. "You think it was about money?" Maigret did not answer. He touched his pipe against his palm, then went across the corridor and knocked at Berthe's door again. She opened quickly, as if she had been listening for the sound. Her eyes were still rimmed with the traces of weeping. "You hear things," he said gently. "Laundry makes you notice more than most. What did you hear last night?" She shook her head too quickly. "Only the taps, then silence. And this morning?" I heard her go. It was early. Her shoes were loud on the stairs, as if she wasn't trying to hide them. I went to the window and saw her cross the street. She didn't look back. Bertha hesitated, then added in a whisper, "She carried nothing, not even her bag." Maigret thanked her and returned to the Lachaume flat. The doctor had arrived, a man of thin patience who bent briefly over the body, muttered about time of death. Sometime in the night, the blow delivered with force, but not hesitation, and then stood back as if eager to be dismissed. Janvier came next, notebook ready, face tight with curiosity. "Routine work," he said, half to himself, trying to impose order. "But the wife gone makes it less routine." "Routine only when all the players are in the room," Maigret murmured. He let Janvier scribble down the details, content to let the young man feel the case was already shaped. He knew it wasn't. A man killed at his own table, his wife vanished with nothing but her shoes, a glass of wine drunk in silence. That was not routine. It was the shape of something small and human and knotted. By midday, the body had been removed, wrapped quickly, and the neighbors had resumed their half-life behind closed doors. Maigret walked the narrow street again. The single working lamp looked harmless in daylight, a rusted post with its head clouded by dust. He touched it, almost absent-mindedly, then turned toward the depot. The chained gate rattled easily under his hand, just as it had the night before. He pushed it open enough to step inside. The sheds stood empty, but the ground bore marks of recent use. Boot prints pressed into damp soil, cigarette ends soft with water, a place where someone had leaned against a wall long enough to leave a patch clean of dust. He bent, picked up one cigarette butt. It was cheap tobacco, rolled unevenly, the kind a laborer would smoke. He pocketed it and moved on. In one corner, beside the crates where the cat had startled him the previous night, he found a rag, blue, frayed at the edges, stiff with something darker. He held it up to the light, then folded it carefully. The depot had been part of the story, though in what way he could not yet tell. Back at the station, he ate a late lunch in the canteen. Soup, bread, a glass of beer. He sat in silence, chewing slowly, listening to the hum of other men's conversations. The case pressed at him, not loudly, but steadily, like a damp coat clinging to his shoulders. He thought of Louise Lachaume, walking quickly into the morning, her shawl tight, leaving behind her purse and her cardigan, leaving behind her husband's body, cooling on the floor. She had not run with money, nor with possessions. She had run with only herself. When he returned to his office, Lognon was waiting. The inspector's face bore its usual expression of grievance. "You've got something at the depot," he said, half accusing, half envious. "I told you that street was nothing but trouble. People complain, nothing happens, then look what comes." Maigret only grunted. Lognon would carry his gloom back to his precinct, convinced that fate had slighted him. He lit his pipe finally, letting the smoke curl upward, and stared out at the rain that had returned, light but steady. It drew blurred lines on the window pane, softening the outline of the Seine beyond. In the quiet, he laid out the pieces again. A man killed cleanly. A wife vanished with nothing, a neighbor who heard her steps but no cry, a depot with its traces of waiting. Each fact was small, ordinary, almost disappointing. Yet together they formed the sort of silence he trusted, the silence that contained an answer waiting to be coaxed out. He would have to wait and listen and let the city decide when it was ready to speak. For now, he made one note on a scrap of paper. Find Louise. Not far. Then he placed the rag from the depot beside it, the dark stain still visible, and let the smoke from his pipe thicken the air until the office smelled of damp tobacco and patience. By 3, he had the rag folded in his pocket and the note on his desk, and the notion of "not far" had grown from a hunch into something more like a map in his head. Louise would not have gone to Ivry. That implied intention, A bag, a ticket, a plan. She had gone where her feet knew their way without consultation. He put on his coat again, told Janvier to keep the papers moving, and set out for the boulevard market where the barrow keepers spoke the same language as women who kept other people's figures straight. The market wore its weekday face, canvas awnings still wet at the seams, produce arranged to look accidental, the chill of the morning clinging to bruised apples. A woman in a wool cap trailed a child who looked everywhere but where he walked. At the far end, beneath a tilted umbrella, stood a barrow heavier with ledgers than with merchandise. The man behind it, Huret, according to the pencil name on a slate, counted coins as if they might take offense. He looked up once, weighed Maigret's familiar bulk and the tired authority in his hat brim, and did not bother to smile. "She kept your books," Maigret said without preface. Huret's mouth made a shape that was not assent and not denial. "The girl from the street," he said. "Louise. She was exact. If a man bought cabbage on credit on Tuesday, he paid it by Friday, or she put his name where it could be seen. I had fewer quarrels with her than with my wife. Was she here this morning? She was not. I thought perhaps she had a fever. She did not have a face for excuses. How was she yesterday?" Huret wiped a coin on his sleeve, though it needed no cleaning. She kept looking up when people spoke, not nervous, attentive as if the market had begun saying something it had never said before, and she wanted not to miss a word. And her husband, a decent fellow. On Sundays you kept him out of your stall, that was all. There is no harm in having the glass, Inspector. The harm begins when the voice follows. Did anyone come to them? A short man in a cap. Huret's eyes brightened with the pleasure of adding a fact. Twice in a fortnight. He stood apart, as men do who are used to looking at watches. He spoke with Lachaume, not here. She saw him once, put her hand on a ledger and did not open it. Name? Inspector, if his mother did not give him one, I cannot supply it for her. Maigret nodded, bought nothing, and left the market with the sense of having been told exactly as much as could be told in full public view. He crossed to the hotel where the laundry girl worked, if only to ask a question whose answer he already suspected. The clerk had the expression of a man who had once hoped to be a pianist and had made his compromise with key racks and bell pulls. "A woman in a grey shawl?" Maigret asked. "This morning." "There were 3, the clerk said. 2 wanted to sell cleaning cloths. 1 wanted to know the time. She looked at the door more than at the clock and did not enter the name we keep for visitors." "How long did she stay?" "As long as it takes to change one's mind," the clerk said with a kind of private melancholy. That was the measure. She had come to the edge of declaring herself and stepped back. Not far. He left the hotel and walked the circumference the way a dog learns the borders of a garden. The timid cafe across from the louder one admitted him with the faint bell that apologies make. Inside, 3 tables, a zinc counter wiped into a permanent dull shine, and a widow with a cardigan buttoned to the top because there was no one to tell her not to. She looked up, saw his face, and set a cup on the counter as if this were the natural extortion the world exacted from her. Coffee for news. "A woman," he said. "Grey shawl. Hands that keep their own counsel." "She sat there," the widow said, pointing to the table near the window. "She asked if she could leave her shawl to dry. I said yes, and she did not. She kept it in her lap and looked at the lamp outside as if it could be persuaded to come on in daylight." "What did she drink?" "She asked for coffee and let it cool until the skin formed. Then she asked me if I knew how to send a telegram. I told her to go to the post, and she said she had no names for the form." "Did she say anything else?" "She asked me what hour the streets begin to empty. I told her, in Paris they empty by degrees, like pots that are watched." "Where did she go?" The widow made the small gesture of a woman who has watched too many departures to certify any one of them. "She went toward the depot, but we both know that does not mean she arrived there." He stood for a while after he had left the cafe, under the clouded head of the lamp that at this hour did not pretend to be anything but a municipal implement. The depot gate worried its chain softly at each gust. He entered again. The sheds received him with the indifference of structures that have long ago given up expecting improvement. He went to the corner where the rag had been, knelt and laid his palm flat on the ground. It came up gritty, and in the grit a faint crescent where someone had scrubbed in a hurry and then stopped. Not enough to erase, enough to take away the first and worst. He followed the thin tide mark, toward a drain, and there, caught in the grill, he saw a thread. Grey wool, no thicker than a vein. He took it between thumb and forefinger and did not smile. Shawls shed as surely as trees. Near the side gate, a watchman emerged, surprised by being made into a fact. He was thin and bald and had a way of tucking his chin into his collar that made his face look like a question to which he feared the answer. "Night work?" Maigret asked. "Sometimes," the man said, "when men think there is money sleeping in crates." He glanced past Maigret toward the street. "There is a woman who stands sometimes by the blue gate. She stands like a person who is reading a timetable with no train to meet. Last night late, and this morning early. She speak to anyone?" She looked at the one lamp as if it were a listener. A man with a cap came late and smoked until it went out. He went away when the rain tired. "Short, heavy. Some men carry their height in their shoulders," the watchman said. This one carried it in his pockets. It would do. Maigret let the shape of the man settle in the air between them and then disperse. He thanked the watchman, left the depot, and returned to the timid cafe as the afternoon thinned. The widow had set a shawl, a different one, brown, upon the back of a chair, as if to remind the room of a presence that might yet present itself. "If she comes back," he said, "you will not be alone." He wrote a name and a number on the corner of a newspaper and left it with a coin whose size embarrassed the counter. Outside, the lamp gave a small premonitory blink, a rehearsal for evening. He stood under it, pipe unlit, and felt the day change color. Across the street, the Lachaume's window remained undecided, curtained still as a held breath. He did not force anything. He let the street and its one lamp prepare their own confession, confident that a woman without a bag, who had been measuring the hours, would not spend the night far from where her fear had first found its shape. The evening thickened with that slow inevitability Paris knew so well, the daylight draining without ceremony until the lamps claimed the streets. Maigret stood with his collar up, pipe stem resting between his teeth, watching as the single lamp flickered to life, throwing its thin cone of light across the stones like a poor actor attempting a monologue. Around it, the shadows crowded closer, stubborn and unwilling to disperse. He had left Janvier at the quay to file his reports and Lapointe to loiter near the depot, eyes sharp for the short man with the cap. But Maigret preferred to remain here, listening to the silence gather itself into a story it was almost ready to tell. The timid cafe still glowed behind its fogged window panes. Inside, the widow polished her counter in circles too small to achieve anything. Once or twice her eyes darted toward the door, not because she expected customers, but because she expected the echo of the shawl. Maigret did not enter. He leaned against the damp wall across the street, content to let her unease play its part. If Louise returned, it would be to this lamplit corner where her absence had begun, not to the station where questions carried the sound of judgment. He thought again of the rag from the depot, the grey thread, the scrubbed patch near the drain. She had been there, perhaps even while he stood smoking under the lamp the night before. That curtain's hesitant movement had not been idle curiosity. It had been her gauging whether the pipe smoke belonged to a neighbor or to fate. He drew from his own pipe now, keeping the flame low, letting the tobacco burn into a steady rhythm. Waiting as ever was an interrogation without words. It was near 9 when a figure approached from the far end of the street. A woman, her gait brisk but unsteady, the kind of walk that betrayed both exhaustion and the determination not to stop. The shawl was indeed grey, damp at the hem, and clutched too tightly at the throat. She paused under the lamp, exactly where he had expected, as though the weak light offered her a fragile sanctuary. Maigret did not move at once. He let her stand, let her draw the breath of someone who has reached a place she both dreads and needs. When he finally stepped from the shadows, he did so slowly, without surprise, as if they had arranged this meeting beforehand. Louise started slightly, then steadied herself, her hand tightening on the shawl. Her face was pale, eyes ringed with the fatigue of 2 nights without real rest. "You've come back," Maigret said, his tone almost conversational. "I never left," she whispered. The words hung uncertainly, not quite true, not quite false. "You were at the depot." She looked at him, searching for accusation and finding none. "I thought if I walked far enough it would become another street, but the lamp followed me. I saw it even when it wasn't there." Maigret nodded as though such things were natural. "Your husband," he said gently. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence that fell was heavier than denial, more eloquent than confession. She swayed slightly, and he guided her with a hand under her elbow toward the cafe. The widow, seeing them enter, straightened, her polishing cloth held like a witness's oath. Louise sank into the chair she had occupied that morning, the shawl slipping to her lap at last. A cup of coffee was set before her, though she made no move toward it. Maigret sat opposite, his large hands folded loosely, pipe resting on the table unlit now. He watched her, not intently, but with the patience of someone who knew time itself would do the questioning. At length she spoke, her voice dry. It was not meant to be like that. He came in, as he always did, tapping twice. I set the table. We had bread, a little wine. He spoke of work, of the depot needing men. I listened. I always listened. But there was something different. His eyes went to the door as if he expected it to open. She paused, eyes on the cooling coffee. When the knock came, I thought it was the neighbor, but it was him, the man with the cap. They spoke softly, quickly. My husband's voice was tight. He said no. The other said yes. I don't know what it was about. Money, perhaps, or work not honest. I only know the voices rose, then stopped. She touched her throat, as though the memory still pressed there. The knife was already in the bread. I didn't see who moved first, but when I looked, it was in him. The man was gone. Gone as if he had never come. I stood and my hands were wet, though I hadn't touched either of them. I cleaned, I scrubbed, but there is always something left. Always. Her voice cracked on the word, but she did not weep. Maigret let the silence answer her. The widow moved softly in the background, wiping the counter, though no cloth could polish away what she was hearing. "You left without your bag," Maigret said. "There was no time. If I stayed, they would think it was me. If I went, they would still think it was me. So I went nowhere. I circled, I waited. I thought perhaps the lamp would tell me what to do. It never did." Her words carried no drama, only the flat despair of truth told too late. Maigret leaned back, filling his pipe slowly, letting the ritual grant her the dignity of having spoken. He did not accuse, nor did he absolve. He only said, "You saw the man before, twice in the street." "Yes," she admitted. "He came with his cap pulled low. He talked to my husband, and I watched from the window. I knew then it would end badly. You can tell when a man carries trouble like another carries a coat. It shows at the seams." Maigret lit his pipe, drawing the smoke gently, eyes fixed not on her, but on the lamp beyond the window. "We'll find him," he said simply, "and until we do, you'll stay where the waiting is easier." She looked at him, startled, as if expecting handcuffs, condemnation, some official gesture, but he gave none. The cafe's warmth, thin as it was, wrapped around her. She placed her hands flat on the table, no longer clutching the shawl, and closed her eyes. Outside, the street settled into its night rhythm. The lamp glowed faintly, stubborn, its light pooling on the clean doorstep once more. Maigret smoked in silence, the case not solved, but its shape revealed, the next step marked by the presence of a man with a cap and pockets heavy with something he had not yet spent. The city would lead him there in its own time, and he would wait, as he always did, until silence gave way to speech. The widow brought a second cup of coffee without being asked, placing it in front of Maigret as if he were part of her household now, a fixture as ordinary as the clock that ticked in the corner. Louise had not touched hers. Her eyes were fixed on the weak light of the lamp outside, and she seemed smaller than before, diminished by having spoken her truth aloud. Maigret watched her a while longer, then rose with the slow heaviness of a man whose decisions were shaped less by rules than by instinct. "You'll stay here tonight," he said to her. "Not in your flat, not at the depot. Here." The widow opened her mouth to protest, perhaps worried about the scandal, but Maigret's look was enough. She nodded, pulling out the extra blanket she kept behind the counter. Louise lowered her head, not in gratitude exactly, but in surrender. Outside, the street had drawn its curtains. Few passed, and those who did quickened their steps under the uneven lamps, eager for warmer rooms. Maigret buttoned his coat, adjusted his scarf, and walked toward the depot where Lapointe waited. He found him near the chained gate, stamping his feet against the chill. The young inspector's face brightened at his approach. "She came?" Lapointe asked. "She came," Maigret confirmed. "She stays in the cafe for now. Tomorrow she'll tell it again, but for tonight, that's enough." "And the man?" Maigret drew from his pipe, letting the smoke curl between them before answering. "He exists. He has weight in his pockets, trouble in his seams, as she put it. That sort of man does not vanish. He circles like a dog around a butcher's shop. He'll be back." They waited together in silence, the rain beginning again with fine needles that pricked the face but never gathered into drops. The depot loomed with its shadows, the sheds like sleeping beasts. Now and then, a tram bell rang faintly from the boulevard beyond, an echo of movement that never reached this forgotten corner. It was close to midnight when a figure appeared at the far end of the street. Short, heavy, shoulders hunched inside a worn overcoat, cap pulled low. He moved with the measured pace of someone who owned the darkness and did not need to prove it. He paused by the depot gate, struck a match cupped in both hands, and lit a cigarette. The flame revealed a broad face, fleshy, unremarkable, but with the set of the mouth that spoke of stubborn will. Lapointe shifted, ready to move, but Maigret laid a hand on his arm. "Not yet," he murmured. "Let him believe he is still invisible." The man smoked slowly, gaze fixed on the one lamp as though it were a companion. When the cigarette was finished, he dropped it, ground it with his heel, and walked toward the blue gate. He tested it with his hand, as if reassuring himself it still held. Then he turned and looked up at the La Chaume's window. The curtain did not move this time, but the glance was long, proprietary. Maigret stepped from the shadows. "Good evening," he said. The man froze, then turned with deliberate slowness, eyes narrowing under the cap. He did not answer. Lapointe came forward a step, his youth too quick for patience, but Maigret's presence steadied the moment. "You know the street," Maigret continued, his voice mild. "You know the lamp that works when the others don't. You know the depot and the blue gate. You even know which window looks down on you." The man's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "And if I do?" "Then you know also what happened at the table inside," Maigret said. His tone carried no accusation, only the inevitability of truth settling into place. The man shrugged, a gesture that tried to make the world smaller than it was. "I wasn't there. You smoked here last night," Maigret replied calmly. You smoked again tonight, and you'll smoke tomorrow unless you're taken elsewhere. A habit is a leash, monsieur. Even the strongest man wears it. The man said nothing, but his eyes flickered once toward the cafe, betraying a thought too quick to conceal. Maigret caught it, filed it away. He did not press. He let silence thicken between them until the man shifted uneasily. "We'll talk tomorrow," Maigret said finally. "At the quay. You know the way." He turned his back deliberately, as if the man were already contained. Lapointe looked startled, but obeyed the gesture to follow. Behind them, the man remained standing under the lamp, motionless, like a shadow pinned by light. Back at the cafe, Louise sat where he had left her, the shawl folded neatly across her knees. The widow dozed in her chair, chin against her chest. Maigret nodded to Lapointe to stay the night nearby, then stepped out once more into the rain. He did not need to watch the man further. He had seen enough. A man who lingered by the blue gate at midnight, who smoked under the only lamp still working, was a man already betraying his own refuge. As he walked back toward the river, Maigret thought of the Lachaume flat, of the bread crust left uneaten, the knife missing from the table. He thought of Louise's voice, flat with fatigue but stripped of lies. And he thought of the man's eyes, small and restless under the cap, measuring the street as if deciding whether it still belonged to him. The city would decide soon enough. It always did. At the quay, his office smelled of stale smoke and damp wool. He sat heavily, wrote a line in his notebook. Cap, returns nightly. Wait, observe. Pressure by silence. Then he leaned back, pipe in hand, and closed his eyes. Outside, the rain tapped on the windows like a cautious messenger. The case had not ended, but it had begun to confess. The morning came slow and damp, a pale light seeping through the fog that clung to the Seine. Maigret rose with the heaviness of a man who had slept little, though his rest had been deep enough to steady him. At the quay, the corridor smelled of ink and wet coats, the sound of typewriters already beginning their monotonous chatter. He hung his hat on the hook, filled his pipe, and waited without hurry. Some men believed in speed. Maigret believed in time pressing down until even the stubborn yielded. At 9:30, Lapointe entered, with rain still in his hair. He looked restless, eager to report. The man with the cap was there again at dawn, he said. He smoked, walked the length of the street twice, and went off toward the boulevard. I followed him until he entered a cafe near the Gare de Lyon. He stayed there, talking to no one, then left. He carries himself like he's waiting for someone who never arrives. Good, Maigret said. Let him wait. A man who waits begins to betray his own impatience. And the woman? She stayed in the cafe all night, slept in the chair, barely moved. The widow fussed over her like a hen. She is calmer this morning, but she looks as though she expects to be taken away at any moment. She will be, Maigret murmured, but not yet. He let Lapointe go fetch her, not with orders, but with a calm instruction. An hour later, Louise sat opposite him in the office, shawl folded on her lap, eyes downcast. She looked smaller in daylight, as though the shadows had lent her a kind of strength she no longer possessed. Maigret offered her coffee, which she sipped without tasting. He did not open with questions. He spoke of the weather, of the market's likely mud, of the slow repairs to the embankments. Only when her shoulders loosened slightly did he lean forward. "Louise," he said, his tone almost paternal, "the knife is gone. We know it was not you who took it. He took it, the man with the cap. But knives carry weight, heavier than pockets alone can hold. He'll want to rid himself of it. Do you know where?" She looked up at him then, startled, as though his words had brushed a thought she had been trying to bury. Her lips parted, but she closed them again. He waited. Outside, a tram bell rang faintly, underscoring the silence. Finally, she said, "There is a drain in the depot courtyard." He looked at it once before leaving. "I thought he would use it." Maigret nodded, as though she had merely confirmed something he already suspected. He rose, signaled to Janvier, and together they went to the depot. The courtyard lay damp and quiet. The sheds crouched like tired animals. At the drain where Maigret had already found the thread, a municipal worker lifted the grate with some effort. They peered inside. At first, nothing but refuse and water met their eyes. Then, glinting dully in the sludge, the hilt of a knife emerged. Janvier reached for it with tongs, drawing it up carefully. The blade was stained, the wood of the handle worn smooth by years of kitchen use. "It's theirs," Maigret said quietly. "From their table." The knife was wrapped, tagged, and carried back. But to Maigret, it was less proof than punctuation. The story already told itself. Still, procedure required its forms, and the knife would speak when the time came. He returned to the quay, pipe smoke thickening the air of his office, and let the silence grow heavy once more. It was late afternoon when the man with the cap appeared at the quay. He entered with the wary arrogance of one who had decided to play the game on his own terms. His name was Marchand, according to the papers he produced. An odd jobber, sometimes at the depot, sometimes at the docks, never long in one place. He had the smell of men who live by half-promises, by waiting in corners until someone needs a task done quietly. "You sent for me," Marchand said, dropping into the chair without invitation. "I did not," Maigret replied mildly, "but I knew you would come. A man who returns to the same lamp 3 nights in a row is already on his way here. Curiosity, perhaps, or fear." Marchand's eyes narrowed. "I've done nothing." "Nothing?" Maigret asked softly. "You came to a table. You spoke of money, of work. There was bread, wine, a wife listening. A knife changed hands, not because you planned it, but because voices rose too quickly. Then you left. You thought the silence would keep your secret. But silence grows heavy, Marchand. It presses until someone breaks." The man shifted, his shoulders tightening against the chair. "She told you that," he muttered. "She told me little," Maigret said, tamping his pipe with care. "Only that you came. Only that when it was over, the knife was gone, and now it is found." He placed a slip of paper on the desk. Not the knife itself, but a note describing it, tagged and sealed. A kitchen knife from their table, in the drain at the depot. A man with heavy pockets might drop such a weight there. Convenient, no? Marchand said nothing, but his jaw worked as if chewing on a word too tough to swallow. Maigret leaned back. "You see, we don't need shouting, nor fists. The city speaks, the streets speak, even the drains. You've been walking in circles around one lamp, Marchand, but lamps don't forget who stood beneath them." The silence in the office was long, broken only by the scratch of Janvier's pen as he noted the exchange. Marchand's hands gripped the chair arms until his knuckles whitened. Finally, his shoulders sagged, a slow collapse rather than a surrender. "I didn't mean to," he muttered. "He said I was a coward, that I'd never do it. He pushed, like he always pushed. I wanted the work, yes, but he mocked me. Then the knife was in my hand. I don't even remember, only that he fell, and she screamed without a sound." Maigret let the words settle, their truth needing no emphasis. He did not look triumphant, only weary. "You'll write it," he said gently. "Janvier will take it down, and Louise will rest, that is all." Marchand bowed his head. The fight drained from him. Maigret reached for his pipe again, relit it, and exhaled slowly. The smoke hung in the air like the final line of a confession already written. The mystery not solved with brilliance, but allowed to reveal itself in its own slow, inevitable time. Marchand's words sat in the room like a weight no one wanted to touch. Janvier kept, his head bent, his pen scratching with steady strokes, though his eyes flicked up once, quick with the flicker of unease that comes when a man's mutterings tilt toward confession. Maigret sat without moving, pipe stem resting between his teeth, gaze fixed not on Marchand, but on the smoke curling toward the ceiling. He knew better than to hurry. Confessions never arrived in one piece. They crept forward like reluctant children. Marchand shifted in the chair, his thick hands restless, pulling at the frayed edge of his cap. "It wasn't meant to go that way," he muttered again, voice roughened by fatigue or shame. He thought himself better than me. Always did. I wanted the work at the depot. Just unloading, nothing grand. But he laughed, said I was only fit for carrying scraps. That kind of talk, it digs at a man. His eyes darted up, meeting Maigret's steady calm, then skittering away. So I showed him. I didn't mean to stick it in so deep. It was quick, too quick. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of a typewriter from the corridor outside. Maigret finally removed the pipe from his mouth, tapping the bowl gently against his palm. "You showed him," he repeated softly. "And then you left him there with his wife." Marchand's throat worked as though swallowing stones. She didn't move, just sat. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't cry out. Not even when I pulled the knife free. She looked at me as if I'd carried out something she'd been waiting for, but she hated me for it all the same. I couldn't stand it. So I left. Where did you go? Nowhere. Everywhere. Walked the streets. Smoked one after another. Ended up at the depot. The knife. Couldn't keep it. Too heavy, like you said. The drain swallowed it. I thought that would be the end. Maigret let him finish, then leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. His voice was low, unhurried. "It's never the end, Marchand. The silence doesn't cover it. It only waits. That's why you came back to the street, night after night. You wanted to see if the lamp would speak. And it did." Marchand's shoulders sagged, his head bowed. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a dull weariness. He rubbed his hands over his face, leaving streaks of grime across his skin. "I don't know why I came back," he whispered. "Maybe I wanted someone to see me, to stop me, to put an end to the walking." Janvier set down his pen, stretching his fingers. "It's all here, Chief," he said quietly. Maigret nodded. He rose slowly, like a man carrying his years as much as the case. "Take him down," he instructed. Marchand did not resist when Janvier stood at his side. The heavy man shuffled out, head lowered as if already half forgotten. Alone, Maigret sat again, filling his pipe and striking a match. The flame lit his face briefly before dying in smoke. He thought of Louise, shawl folded neatly, hands pressed against the cafe table. She had spoken without lies, though not with the whole truth. She had seen her husband fall, seen Marchand leave, and had done nothing. Not from malice, not from guilt, only from the paralysis of someone who has lived too long in silence. In the evening, he walked back to the street with the one lamp. The widow at the cafe greeted him with a nod, setting a glass of beer before him without a word. Louise still sat at her usual place, shawl drawn close again. She looked up when he entered, and something in her eyes, relief perhaps, or only exhaustion, softened. He told her simply, "It's done. Marchand has spoken." She breathed out, a sound closer to a sigh than a sob. "So it was him," she murmured. "You knew," Maigret said gently. "I knew it could not have been me," she replied, her lips trembling with a bitter irony. "And yet I knew they would think it so. That is why I walked, why I waited by the gate. I thought perhaps the lamp would tell someone else before they asked me." Maigret regarded her steadily, his broad face unreadable. "The lamp is only iron and glass. It doesn't speak. But people do, when the silence grows too heavy." She lowered her gaze. "What will become of me? You will give your statement. You will go on living. Nothing more dramatic than that. The world rarely gives punishment to those who simply watch. But you'll carry it, Louise. That is punishment enough." She nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. The widow hovered in the background, listening but not intruding, her eyes filled with the quiet pity of someone who had seen too many endings. Maigret finished his beer, left coins on the counter, and stepped once more into the damp night. The lamp glowed steadily, throwing its small circle of light unchanged and indifferent. He paused beneath it, pipe smoke curling around his head, and looked up at the Lachaume's window. The curtain was drawn, still and final. As he walked away, the rain began again, soft but persistent, tapping on the stones like a reminder that Paris never forgot, only absorbed. Another case closed, not with triumph, but with the weary understanding that human folly and weakness would always find new shapes. He drew deeply on his pipe, the smoke warming his chest, and let the city's silence settle around him once more. The truth had come, not in shouts or revelations, but in the slow, inevitable way it always did, drawn out by waiting, by listening, by the quiet presence of a man who understood that crime was only another way of being human. The following morning, the city seemed rinsed of its weariness, though Maigret knew that was only an illusion. The rain had lifted, leaving the pavements glistening, and a faint sun tried to press through the haze. He walked slowly toward the quay, coat buttoned, pipe unlit, the taste of damp tobacco lingering in his mouth. The night had been short, filled with heavy thoughts that did not disturb him so, much as they accompanied him, like familiar ghosts. At the office, Janvier was already waiting, papers neatly arranged on the desk, his expression eager in the way of younger men who still believed in tidy resolutions. Marchand repeated his statement this morning, he said. Signed it too. The knife matches. It's as clear as it can be. Nothing is clear, Maigret replied, sinking into his chair with a groan. Not to the people who live it. To them it will never be tidy. Janvier shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. He had learned when not to press. Maigret lit his pipe, drawing deeply, filling the room with its acrid smoke. He thought of Louise again, shawl wrapped tight, eyes fixed on the lamp as if it had been her confessor. She would live on, though life would never return to its old shape. Marchand, heavy-shouldered, pockets full of failure, would spend his years behind walls, his restlessness finally caged. And Lachaume, with his half-finished plate of bread, was beyond caring. Yet for all that, the street still had to go on, with its broken lamps, its quiet neighbors, its tired concierge. By midday, he found himself walking back there, drawn less by duty than by habit. The narrow street looked almost ordinary in the pale light, though the stains on the stone still whispered of the body carried out only days before. The one working lamp stood silent now, a mute reminder of the nights it had witnessed. The concierge stood in her doorway, arms folded, eyes sharp as always. She gave him a look that mixed suspicion with reluctant respect. "They've been asking," she said without preamble. "The neighbors. Was it her? Was it someone else? I tell them little. Better they don't know too much." "They'll know soon enough," Maigret answered quietly. "It was not her. That will be enough for them." The concierge sniffed. "People will believe what they prefer. A woman gone missing is always easier to blame. She walked too quickly, they said. She avoided their eyes. They'll remember those things now, not the truth." Maigret nodded. It was always that way. People clung to suspicions more tightly than to facts. He left her to her doorstep and walked the length of the street. The windows were shuttered, curtains drawn, the neighborhood folding in on itself. At the depot, the chain still hung loosely, the gate rattling with the slightest breeze. The sheds loomed in silence. It struck him that for all its menace, the depot had only ever been a stage, a backdrop where restless men and frightened women played out small, brutal dramas. The city would supply another soon enough. Later that afternoon, he returned to the cafe. The widow greeted him with her customary nod, setting down a glass without words. Louise was gone. The widow explained she had left that morning, shawl over her shoulders, thanking no one, looking as if she would dissolve if touched. Maigret felt no need to pursue her. She had said what she needed to say, and her life now belonged to silence again. Perhaps she had gone back to her sister in Ivry, perhaps to another small room where no one asked questions. He would not look for her. He sat a long time in the cafe, pipe smoke mingling with the bitter scent of coffee grounds. The widow polished the counter, the sound of the cloth against metal steady, comforting. Now and then a customer entered, ordered wine, muttered about prices, and left. Ordinary life reclaimed the space with stubbornness. Maigret drank slowly, his thoughts circling back to the beginning. The rain that had drawn him out, Lognon's complaint about the broken lamps, the sense of something watching in the silence. It had all grown from such small roots. That was how it always was. When evening fell, the lamp flickered on again, casting its pale circle on the stones. Maigret stepped outside, watching it glow. The street was quiet, the sound of the city muffled, as if this place belonged to another rhythm. He remembered the old woman with the basket who had first spoken to him there, her dry humor about promises and shortages. She was not in sight now, but he could almost hear her voice. He wondered what she thought of it all, if she would shrug and say, "Such things happen. Tomorrow the lamp may fail again." He drew from his pipe, exhaled into the night air, and felt the familiar weight of the city pressing down, not cruelly, but firmly, reminding him that his work was never truly finished. There would always be another street, another silence, another human knot to untangle. The mystery of this street with one lamp had ended, but not neatly, not completely. It ended as life always did, with loose threads, with people left to carry their burdens, with the faint glow of light barely holding back the dark. Maigret turned at last, heading toward the boulevard, where the noise of traffic grew louder, more insistent, pulling him back into the broader life of Paris. He walked heavily, but without haste, his scarf snug at his throat, the taste of tobacco lingering. Tomorrow there would be files on his desk, petty complaints, perhaps another call that seemed trivial until it wasn't. That was the rhythm, and he had long since learned to let it carry him. Behind him, the street settled once more into its half-forgotten obscurity. The lamp shone steadily, casting its small circle, indifferent to what it had seen, to what it might yet see. The city would remember in its own way, and Maigret, weary but calm, would be there to listen when the silence spoke again. The days that followed carried the weight of routine, but Maigret knew that cases lingered in corners of the mind long after the files were stacked away. Marchand's confession was complete, his statement matched by the knife, by the timing, by the weary certainty that no other version fit. Louise was seen once more, only briefly, passing through the market with her shawl drawn close, ignoring the glances of neighbors who whispered but dared not stop her. The concierge muttered that she kept her curtains shut now, and perhaps that was for the best. At the quay, paperwork gathered, stamps fell on sheets, and the prosecutor's office accepted the case without fuss. For them it was tidy, a quarrel over work, a knife, a man with a temper, a widow left to fend for herself. Yet Maigret felt the undertow beneath. He thought of Louise's silence, of her eyes fixed on the lamp, of the way she had circled the depot like a ghost before allowing herself to be found. She had not lied, but she had not told everything either. Her silence had been complicity of a kind, though one born not from malice, but from the helplessness of a life lived in shadows. He did not blame her. He had seen too many like her, women who endured, who bent themselves around the tempers of men, who learned to hold their tongues until silence became a second skin. When violence finally broke the surface, they were both relieved and condemned by it. The law would not touch her, but she would carry the weight longer than Marchand ever could. One evening, Maigret returned to the street once more. The rain had ended, the air sharp with the smell of coal fires. the lamp still burned, its light steady, casting the same pale circle it always had. The street was quiet, neighbors keeping to themselves, the depot gates rattling faintly in the wind. He stood beneath the lamp, pipe in hand, and let the silence wrap around him. It no longer felt watchful, only tired, as if the secret it had held had been spoken at last, and the stones could rest again. The widow from the cafe appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's finished, then?" she asked. "It's finished," Maigret said. She nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the acceptance of someone who had seen too many beginnings and endings to expect much difference between them. "The lamp will go out soon," she remarked. "They'll replace it, perhaps, or perhaps they won't, but people will forget." "People always forget," Maigret agreed, "but the street remembers in its own way." He stayed a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of Paris around him, the distant rattle of a tram, the faint cry of a child through a window, the shuffle of feet on stone. Then he turned, heavy-footed, and walked back toward the river. There was no triumph in the case, no dramatic unmasking, no applause for cleverness, only the truth, uncovered slowly, patiently, by waiting and watching until silence gave way. It was enough. That was always enough. As he reached the boulevard, the noise of the city rose around him once more. He tightened his coat, drew deeply on his pipe, and let the smoke warm his chest. Tomorrow would bring another file, another silence to listen to, another human knot to untangle. And he would be there, steady as the lamp that burned against the darkness, listening until the truth spoke for itself. The mystery of the street with one lamp had ended, not with spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability that belonged to Maigret, who knew that every crime was simply another story of people, ordinary, flawed, and unbearably human.